This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Rick Reaser was the 8-bit editor of Current Notes magazine, a popular magazine dedicated to the Atari computers. He began in 1992 and wrote a column called 8-Bit Tidbits. Rick used his Atari 8-bit computer exclusively through his college years and for programming for grad school. He was also president of P3ACE, Pikes Peak Poke Atari Computer Enthusiasts, a user group serving the Colorado Springs area. This interview took place on February 11th, 2023.
I actually remember you. I mailed stuff to you.
Yeah? When
you're in Arcata. In fact, it's on that website where you scanned everything. And I kind of think that you were in the late end because I had the full collection of current notes from almost all of them. And I sold them to somebody. Then I had duplicates of certain ones, and I think you got one of the duplicates. But if you look at the cover of one of them, it has my name on it. It has your address on it in Arcata, and the postage stamps on the front of it. So
neat.
Anyway, so that's pretty.
I don't see any emails from you, but I have emails going back a long time. But
well, this isn't email. This is snail mail. So if you go to there's a page on archive.com, whatever, of Current Notes magazines, and the one that I mailed to you actually shows up, and it's like I don't know, what is it? It's probably
I know which one you mean. Yeah, there's your name right there. Yeah, the one with the joystick in the field.
Yeah.
Nice.
So anyway, so we've had some. It just shows how far advanced our Alzheimer's is. That's what that sort of tells you. So I got into computers because my dad got into Atari. Is what happened. My dad was an engineer at Hughes Aircraft, and so right before I got married in '81, but prior to that, my dad would take me down to the South Bay Atari Computer Enthusiast Club, which is down on Artesia in I guess in Manhattan Beach, and he got very, very interested in computers. He was sort of a technology kind of guy, and I remember when I was a very small child, when transistors started being a big deal, he just dove into that because he was into valves. If you know what valves are, tubes and stuff like that. So he was very much into technology. So he sort of dragged me along, and I was single at the time, and I was in the Air Force, and so we would go down to these meetings. And so he bought an Atari 800, and I thought it was pretty cool, and I would go with him to these meetings and so forth down there. And then after we got married in '81. The next year I said, well, this is pretty cool. My dad was doing all this stuff with this computer and primarily focused on things about, obviously into games and all, but like trying to figure out how to do stuff useful around the house with the PC. And so I kind of got interested in that, and I bought my first Atari 800 and a disk drive and a monitor and that kind of stuff. I bought first had a television set, then I went to a regular monitor. But anyway, so that's kind of how I got in. I was very much into trying to do useful things with it around the house, which was sort of, that was supposed to be the PC revolution and all that, and that was sort of my main interest in the.
What kind of useful things? Controlling lights and things like that?
Oh, like taxes. No, I'll tell you later on, I got into can we use computers to control stuff? Because that was about the time in the early '80s when numerical control machines, NC tape machines, were coming out. And I worked in the space industry. And so I remember when Rockwell got their first 5-axis milling machine, it was basically run off these punch tapes. And I just thought that was fascinating stuff. So I became interested in machine control and stuff like that from computers. But I was primarily so what you could do around. I was keeping track of stuff, made a database of all my albums and things like that. Wines, were a little, we were liked wine, so I kept track of that. But primarily that and word processing and those kinds of things. At that time is when things like bulletin boards were coming up, and I remember I got my first 300 baud modem, and I did those did those kinds of things with bulletin boards. My dad was very much into bulletin boards. He liked writing, so a lot of it was like word processing. Word processing was kind of coming into its own. Prior to that time, IBM had a Selectric 2, which had memory for things, and there was a big line at I was in the global positioning system program office for secretaries to use that so that they could edit their texts and stuff like that, and it had a card, a mag card reader, and that's how they did stuff like that. So word processing, spreadsheets like VisiCalc and those kinds of things were into that. And so basically using computers to do tasks, my office tasks, I guess, when you think about it. But I was interested in doing those things for the home, like keeping track of things at the home, like my tools and records and stuff like that. And then when I think Tax Advantage was the first tax program that came out, and I'd done my taxes on that program. So that was sort of my main interest. Obviously, I was into the games. My dad and I liked Star Raiders a lot. That was like a super popular game, and there were some other games that we played. Jawbreaker was another one we liked to do, and so my wife never really got into it. She said, "What are you doing in there?" This stuff, because it's fascinating. The other thing I was interested into was programming. So at that time, I was on the GPS satellite, and on the in the at the factory in the where we built the satellite. That these are like Commodore business machine stuff, and those are Commodore 64s that ran large test control suites of satellite test equipment, and then. So that was sort of fascinating to me because that was something I understood. So I got into assembly language, and I got assembly language compiler and those kind of things, and I did a little bit of that on Atari. I learned the 6502 assembly language because at work it was very similar. Commodore used I think they might have used 65.2, but I was running the software programs, and that was back when you wrote your own macros and you actually wrote your own languages, things like that, and then compiled them. But so one of the first really full up computer control things was our UHF crosslinks, and those were all programmed in a Commodore 64 thing, and then compiled and put into a microprocessor that generate FFTs and stuff like that to do finding frequencies and stuff like that. Pretty fascinating stuff. But I really felt at that time I was like on the cutting edge of everything that had to do with computers, and I was in my early 20s, and it was like the computer age revolution. I was just fascinated by it because everything was going to computers in the space business, and we had like these giant mainframes like CDC 3800s and things like that, which literally my watch has more power than those things had. So that was kind of it was part of my dad. My dad was the one that kind of got me into that. He was an electrical engineer at Hughes, and very much into technology, and always was onto the latest thing, and took those things very personally. So that's sort of my background in this whole thing.
Thank you. Great. All right. So you're playing with your computer and you're doing assembly language, and then what? You were involved with some users groups, and let's talk about that.
Yeah. So basically, I was very much a very avid attender of the South Bay Atari Computer Enthusiast, and they had it was kind of amazing that H&W Computers is where it was, and literally the store was packed. I mean, the user group meetings back then were extremely popular, and you got to meet a lot of interesting people and hear about these things. And that was about the time when computer generated voices were being done. So that was like a huge thing. I got that program, learned all about it and how this generates sounds. Because what happens was, the computer is one thing, but then there's all these things that hook up to it, like modems and sound things and so forth. And so that was I had fond memories of that, and it was very, very popular. And you always ended up trying to buy something when you went to that store. I think that was the reason why the meetings were at the store and so forth. Uh, then I was in 1983. I was reassigned to the Pentagon and moved to Virginia, and they had a very, very large, strong computer Atari community up there run by Joe Waters. And Joe Waters was actually a CIA analyst. I think he was in the IT department actually. And so he was the guy that invented open source intelligence. If you look at this guy up, but he was the president. He lived out in Sterling. He ran the Washington Area Computer Enthusiasts, the WACE thing, and that's where Current Notes started. So it was called. They had a little newsletter prior to that, and then he sort of made it into more of a magazine. But what was fascinating out there was they had these like multiple clubs. Like Novatari was one of them, and so they kind of got together. But they had these giant expos that took over like high school gymnasiums of people with their computer stuff, selling things, demonstrating things, their programs, and that was just another whole, cultural world. And of course, at that time, the internet really wasn't around. There was probably BitNet and a couple things, and obviously ARPANET, which is primarily universities and DoD research, but that had not really happened at that time. It was more about individual people's computers and showing how to use it. I think part of this may be that, and clearly there were some women involved, but once again, male dominant thing, but a lot had to do with, I think, demonstrating to your wife this computer that you had was more than just a game machine. I think that was a continual struggle with guys that like computer back then, trying to figure out how to use this thing. But that's when they got into things like turning your lights on and off and timers and things like that to actuate stuff. And the Atari was kind of cool because you could do all that stuff through like the game ports and other out. They had enough mechanization in the computer itself that you could actually flip switches and things like that if you knew how to do that. So anyway, that was the first club, and then after that I went to I think Peterson Air Force Base, and that was the Pikes Peak Atari computer enthusiasts, and they had a big store in Denver, and that was a very popular club. And that was about the time that the MIDI interface for STs came out, and MIDI Maze was like a huge deal with our club, and we had these giant things. And obviously it was an 8-bit thing, but it was an awful lot of fun. And so I was always involved with the various clubs, and that was really a source of support and knowledge for what went on in the Atari business, because the clubs were very, very strong back then. So anyway, that's sort of history. But that's where I met Joe Waters when I made my first assignment at the Pentagon. That's where I got to know him, and I like I said, my view was to figure out some way to make some practical things rather than just playing games. Although I love to play games and stuff like that.
Right. Well, okay, I have a question for you. And you said that some of the GPS stuff was done on Commodores, and you had the buddy who worked at the CIA and such. So were interesting secret government projects done on Ataris ever?
Not that I know of. It was really the wild, wild west back then. I mean, maybe NSA had something like that, but a lot of what was going on was the things of just keeping track of stuff and having databases, those kind of things. GPS, like I said, the ground control equipment was all, or the ground equipment was all tested with CBM machines. And that was they had like programs that were written. That language mate was the language that was used, and that was pretty much Commodore. Something automated test equipment master or something, but it was a mill standard on that. The satellite, by the way, I was one of the guys. The early satellites used what they called an 8-bit bit splice, two 4-bit ALU RAMs were bit spliced together, and that was the computer on GPS. So I was involved when we went to block 2. I said, why don't we use like a real microcomputer, a 1.17 megahertz screamer, and it's 48K on this baby, and do that. And that's what ended up happening. We used the TI 9989, which was the TI 99 game machine computer, and we screened those parts, rad hardened them, and that was all written in the TI 9989, which is very similar to 6502 and that same kind of architecture, although the language is different. And then we wrote that, by the way, in something called Jovial, which was the DoD version of Fortran, and they compiled that, loaded that in the RAM, and it was a high order language computer program. That was the original GPS was run on basically a game machine.
Wow.
If you think about that.
I don't know the TI 9989. I've heard of the TI 99 4A, things like that, but I haven't heard
the 9989 was the souped up version of that thing. The 99 4A, I think, was the name of their computer, but that was the actual chipset. So if you can Google it. So the chip was called the 9989. And that was what it just had come out when we were trying to figure out a microprocessor to do that. I think Motorola wasn't interested in going through rad hardness. GPS is in the radiation belts, and so you worry about bit flips and stuff like that, and total dose and stuff like that. But that was one of the first satellites that actually used a computer, microprocessor in space, and it was based on a game machine. It was a game machine chip.
Nice. That's really cool. So you eventually became editor, the 8-bit editor of Current Notes. You had a column called 8-bit Tidbits. You didn't start that, as far as I can tell, until relatively late in the 8-bit game. I think your editorship started in 1992.
Yes.
So I mean the 8-bit was getting kind of long in the tooth even at that point.
Oh, absolutely. But there was still a very loyal fan base out there. The advantage, I will tell you, of these earlier computers, and especially Atari, since it had it was a fully open architecture. You could have the entire memory map and actually understand how it worked. It had the specialized chips, the Antic and the other ones where you could do, player missile graphics and those kind of things. So I literally understood what every register did, kind of a thing. And when the ST came out and the Amiga and all these other kind of machines, you started to lose touch with what do computers really mean? Because I really did understand at that time in my life how a computer really worked. I think that, and that was the fascinating part about that. A lot of people that are in computer science, they really don't know how computers work. You ask them, well, how do you add in a computer? Well, I call up the routine, out of C++, and they add and put the two number operation, and it appears in this register, appears in this memory location. Well, when I was doing this, you were writing ASL, LDA, LDX. You were literally, exclusive ORing bits to add, to subtract, multiple, and divide. So I was not comfortable losing touch with how the computer actually worked and what was going on, where things were in the stack, and how all that stuff worked. So when the newer computers came out, I felt that was a bridge too far, and I didn't want to learn a new thing. So I stuck with it, and I also felt that the Atari 8-bit could actually do a lot more things. The other thing I loved about it was when I was in grad school, I used a Mac to write my thesis, but I didn't use my Atari to write my master's thesis. Although I did all my programming at home in the Atari. Pascal ran on the Atari, and I can talk about that a little later. But basically, it took forever for the 264-bit ROMs to boot up in a Mac. And with the Atari, you turn it on and the screen's going, right? You have to get your prompt, and so that was one of the things I felt annoying about this thing, because they were loading the operating system, typically off another ROM into a bunch of RAM, and it took a long time. So I just said, I understand this, I love it, and it does everything I want. And I really got into the other kinds of things that you may have read about, but I had a 10 megabyte hard drive on mine. I bought all that ICD stuff with the MIO box and a hard drive. I was one of the first guys that bought a 2400 baud modem to hook up to this thing, and it went into DDN, which is Defense Digital Network, which is the follow-on of ARPANET. And I was very much into the internet at that time. We had a course at Naval Postgraduate School about the internet. It was cutting edge kind of stuff back in then. So I felt that the 8-bit could do a lot more than people gave it credit for. And I got into the graphic operating system stuff for Diamond, if you remember that. But I had everything working on with the graphic operating system, because you could, Atari sort of set up, it has those ways of doing that. So I never really I kept using my Atari for everything. And then I got into that article, and I was also very much into using the Atari for the early days of the internet with CompuServe, and then all the bulletin boards and all that, which were all kind of Atari. Because I think the big issue was for me, as I could really understand how that worked, and I wasn't comfortable having to relearn a whole new thing and then get to levels of abstraction where I really wasn't understanding what was happening at the register level. Does that make sense to you? I mean,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the MIO board and the hard drive. I understand your setup was pretty sweet back in the day.
oh yeah.
Um, most people wouldn't have that equipment unless they were like running a BBS or something.
I was doing it because I was writing programs for grad school on it.
Yeah.
And then I'd write them and debug them on my 8-bit because it's high order language, right? And then I would upload it into the PDP-11 or VAX 1170, which is literally less power than my triathlon watch, So it's like, it was some of the programs took a long time. I was very much into a random number generation. I was fascinated by Don Knuth's books. If you ever read the Art of Computer Programming, I highly recommend it if you can get through it. But we were doing a lot of sort of stochastic simulations. Back then was when you had computers, you didn't have to have a closed form solution for a lot of these, integrals and things that were like simulations, like multiple trial stuff. So we basically, got into writing, we'll just try every possible thing, then summarize the data. And you can do that with a digital computer rather than solving for a closed form solution of some sort of a simulation or problem. So that's where I think the Atari fell apart, because it only operates at 1 megabit. And if you're trying, 10,000 trials of something that has a very long set of conditions, and that just literally takes forever. So a lot of that work, you can write the code for that and debug the code to run a simulation, but then I would load that up into the mainframe at school. But I would get all the algorithm stuff worked out at home. And by the way, the other thing, people were super jealous. Well, how come I don't see you in the computer lab? Says I'm at home with my newborn daughter and doing it on my Atari 800, Atari 130XE at that time. And he says on an 8-bit computer, says, yeah. In fact, I probably can debug things faster because I'm not waiting for the whole thing to boot up on a dumb terminal and all that kind of stuff. So that was pretty. That to me, that was a pretty fascinating thing. But that's why I had all that stuff. I only had the 256 MIO board, by the way. They had a screaming, megabyte version, which was like twice as expensive. But like I said, that kind of got back to, but I understood every port, every connector, what all the pins did. And to me, I felt like I was really very much in control of my destiny by being able to do that. As you probably recall, when Atari first made their computers, not so much the 130XE, but in the 800XL and then in the 800, you had to buy the memory cards separately. Well, I made all mine. I bought the cards. I got sockets. First we tried, my dad and I, when we first got our computer, we were going to solder all these things onto the board. That was like a disaster. So, and remember the chips back then were extremely expensive. There were, 8-pin dips, and a lot of them. So we got ones that had pre-soldered things. We just pushed them in, make sure we put them in the right direction. But like I said, that was the issue back then was had a lot of control over what what happened at a very basic level. So but that's yeah. But most people didn't have that. But I thought it was pretty cool, and I had lots of stuff. Other thing is I wrote a lot, so I had a lot of files of writing and things like that that are on that hard drive of different things because I was tracking a lot of stuff and so forth.
Nice.
So
So your dad was into the Atari, and then you got into
mhm,
the Atari, and then I found a
mhm.
letter from you to Antic Magazine, where you were talking about how your kids loved playing Talking Toddle, the game
Right.
for little kids out of Antic Magazine. So now we've got three generations of Atari users here.
Right. They the two oldest ones, I hate to say I kind of somewhat forced that. It was one of these useful things you could do with a computer that I could justify to my wife while I was going away to meetings and had all this hardware and equipment, plus using it for school, which is a useful thing. Didn't have to, go and be on campus. I could, help babysit when I was at grad school. And so yeah, my kids liked it. They did a pretty good job. Obviously not even close to what we do today in terms of our ability to write computer-based training and things like that, because I was involved with that when I was at Raytheon in terms of writing computer-based training programs for education. But to me, that was sort of new, and that you just didn't interaction with a device was something that was new, right? I mean, we didn't really have that. I mean, you had Simon, that was about it. So and then they had little like Speak and Spell had come out during that time period, but totally customized interface and so forth. But with a general purpose computer, you can do lots of things and with joysticks and things like that. But yeah, right, exactly. My kids all the oldest ones, and later on when the other two were born, they were born in '92, and I bought my first 386, and then the Atari kind of went on the back burner when Windows 95 came out. So, and I still have that original email account, that MSN account that you see. That's when Microsoft had its own. You bought the modem from them, and
Hmm.
they got it. I mean, it was like a fully, and then they sold it off, but they didn't sell off the domain. So I've kept that MSN account since 1995.
Found a thing for you when you became president of P3ACE, February
Right.
1990.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what's P3 stand for?
But it says Pikes Peak something Atari Computer Tuesday. Pikes Peak something. I'd have to look it up.
Where was Pikes
But
Peak? What?
Pikes Peak. Oh, it's at Peterson Air Force Base. So it
Oh,
was in
okay.
Colorado Springs.
All
So
right.
yeah.
You had written one of the things so February 1990. One of the
Mm-hmm.
things I'm interested in is having the club support the Atari Revolution. For those of you who have not heard about this, it's a plan for Atari users to take matters into their own hands and try to get more exposure and support for Atari computers here in the United States. How'd
Mm-hmm.
that work out for you?
Well, we had some meetings and talked about that, and a lot of people got excited. I think much beer was drinking as we discussed the process for that. So, um, yeah, I think at that time there was a great deal of consternation about the way the Atari people in Sunnydale were running the company, right, and what exactly was happening, because there was a lot of turmoil back then. They had a great thing, primarily game oriented, although they'd come out with some other things, and that's where I kind of got into this. I wanted to get into this thing about computer controlled things, so I bought the starter lab, and they had these science things you
Oh, the
could plug
science
in,
kits. Sure.
science kits you could plug in, which basically mechanized a lot of the things and made it easier for you to have some sort of an interface with the devices through your computer. And that was a good thing. But Atari was going through a lot of issues back then about where Star is going and what's happening with the ST and the Falcon and all these things, which were it all gets down to marketing and then figuring out where the sweet spot is in the consumer base, and they didn't actually do that, and they were fighting against Blue. The 286 had come out, or the IBM PC, and PC Juniors. It's a total disaster, some of the stuff that was out there, but people bought it because, oh my God, this must be good because it's done by
Right.
this
It's
big
IBM.
company. Yeah,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
IBM. So
No one
Um,
ever got fired for buying IBM, right?
no.
Um,
So, but that was part of it. We're going to take the management all the time because the company was letting us down. That was the real issue. That
yeah.
was a, that was what that was about.
I find it fascinating that, I mean, I have someone who's been archiving newsletters and things Atari newsletters and things for a long time. I'm familiar with current notes and San Leandro Computer Club and all the big ones. But then like,
SLCC.
yeah,
Yeah.
but there's the little super niche ones like the Atari users at an Air Force base, or like
Oh yeah.
I guess you have some newsletters for the Atari Club at the Hughes Aircraft Corporation. I
Yeah.
mean,
Hughes had his own Atari club. Yeah. And
so
there were a lot of them. There's a bunch of them in Arizona and New Mexico. I used to get their newsletters, and I was subscribed to them, uh, and uh, and I think that's part of the current notes thing to figure out what was going on. People sent me their stuff, and I think that what was interesting about that was there was just such great joy in having your own computer and all the things you were figuring out what to do with it. And you're like nobody else, not very many people had computers back then. And you had a computer. That was really kind of a special thing. And people took great pride in that and trying to figure out what to do with it. And obviously the big thing that computers did in terms of, I think, society was the first word processing database and then spreadsheets. And the second was the internet, which allowed those kind of things to happen. And it's like you look back at that, says, God, I was there when that was starting out. I was trying to figure out how to hook my modem up to the internet. I was talking to other people, and I managed to do all of the stuff on current notes and all the other things I did with my 8-bit using, CompuServe and bulletin boards and the way we did stuff back then. Nobody else was doing that. I mean, literally, and you felt like, I'm doing something somebody else is doing. When I was at Peterson Air Force Base, we we had a guy who's a Mac geek, and so we got remember those single device Macs with a tiny little black and white screen on them,
sure, yeah,
so we got Apple Talk. We hooked up a network in our office, and then we tried to figure out, is there some way we can hook this up to the rest of like DARPA? And that was DDN at the time, and we were trying to be, but we had email to other bases and where did that come from? There was a huge Mac club, in Peterson Air Force Base, and so they were very much into that because that was part of the thing that I thought was and this is when where the Atari's letting us down, take matters in their own hands thing, because what was going on was Mac figured out that networking was like a big deal early on, and that was a long time ago, so and Atari was not going down that path. You could buy a Hey Smart modem or something like that and hook it in and through your RS-232 or whatever and that kind of stuff. But they weren't really focused on networking at all until the ST came out, and the networking was done through MIDI,
right,
which
yeah.
I thought was, which is kind of a crazy thing, and that's so I don't know. So that was kind of the sort of the neat thing about it. So but those are I think those are the things that hit people's home. Now you have other things where now we kind of gone into device things. So everything's hooked to the internet. It's all run by computers, including your thermostat and your lights and switches, individual switches in your house, or all computer enabled and so forth. So it's kind of come a long ways. But at the time we were experimenting on computer. I remember I got very much into like, how do you make voices come out of a computer? And if you remember the whole thing about it was sort of like a synthesizer in some ways. You have registers that create different frequencies, and you have to have a device that controls that and control the frequency and
Yeah.
pitch, which was what that was. And then it was just a fascinating thing. Learned a lot about how phonemes work and language and consonants and vowels and things like that. Never would have done that if I would have not gotten involved with computers. Been no reason to, but
Sure.
so that was kind of was gone. But Yeah, I kept the Atari the 8-bit alive until the very last issue of Current Notes. So it was when it folded shop, but it was pretty clear that the Falcon was going nowhere. You know,
So when you're doing the column for current notes, and you did that for a long time, what strikes as in your memory as like what seemed important at the time, or like the big controversies, or the big thing? Is anything like stick in your mind like this was
I
interesting
think
or important?
one of the interesting things that I thought was that I noticed by this was that um, the cost of computers was quite expensive during that time. If you wanted to go to buy something new and fascinating, most people couldn't really afford an ST. You could get a used 8-bit, and that was especially true for the foreign contributors. I did a lot of work with people in other countries. Some of them were U.S. expats, and so what ends up happening is the US at that time, it would turn over technology 3 times faster than Canada, and I had Canadian authors and stuff like that, and they didn't get into the newer computers because they were expensive, weren't necessarily available, and so I think there was this issue of the digital divide back then was more about cost of equipment than having to learn a new thing, because every time you got a new computer, you had to learn something new, so people were comfortable with it. I loved learning new things, but the point was, if I can do what I have, why bother, kind of a thing. And so the then what ended up happening at the end of the thing, my dad said, we had a guy here who built computers who was at the Hughes Club, and so he got into building 386s back then, the screamers, back then. So, and that's why we ended up switching. And he got one, I got one. My dad, who's obviously a lot older than I am, but he was very much into this whole thing about doing. But he kept his 8-bit to the bitter end till we both bought and had 386s built by this guy in the Hughes Computer Club, and he stayed with it because he's with supporting the 8-bit club. But it started to die out after a while because the PC, once they got the Pentium processor going, there was no turning back in terms of what was going on. They had your Mac
Sure.
people, and with the one button mouse with a black and white screen that and so it was kind of the interesting. I'll tell you the other thing that was kind of interesting. Uh, the other thing that was important back then was just how much better the Atari 8-bits were than the Mac 2s. That was another big issue for people. We used to talk about that. And interestingly, I still this day think it had a superior architecture in terms of how the thing was organized and all that. But that was something that we used to talk. We didn't write about it too much, but people would talk about that. Why did that guy still have a Mac 2 Plus? What is that all about? I think barely works. So and kludgy and all that kind of stuff. They fixed all that stuff, with Lisa and with the other things that when
Oh,
the
you mean the Apple IIs, the
Apple, yeah,
yeah,
Apple II, yeah,
the Apple
the
II, yeah,
Apple II. I'm
right.
sorry, not I mean Apple II. That was a big issue back. How come those guys still use it? So, but I think the issue of cost of upgrading was like a huge deal for folks back then, and then availability of new things was becoming an issue back then. Taking the computer to its full limit, because there's still a lot of things that that the computer could do. Although they did finally get in with the Diamond GOS and all those things, which were pretty fascinating. They had buggy problems with them and so forth, but that used a lot of the parametric graphics kind of things in terms of how things moved around the screen. Could understand that, and whereas Xerox Star and the other computers that were coming out at that time that had graphic interfaces, then that was pretty much invented by Xerox and copied by Jobs is what ended up happening. Those were very difficult to understand how they worked, and they had a totally different thing in terms of how the screens worked. The Atari didn't transition to things like VGA and those kind of graphic things because they didn't need to. Although eventually you're going to have to go to that stuff. Now we map to individual pixels on televisions now, so but then we have the computer processing to do that, and So, but that I think that was the issue. I think cost, and then the international market about how that worked. Because I was dealing with a lot of foreign authors. That's where a lot of these guys came from because they were sort of catching up to where the U.S. was, a year prior in terms of what was going on. So, and a lot of self-programming. The nice thing about the Atari 800 was you could really do a lot of the programming yourself. You got into some of these other ones, you really had to be a lot smarter to do that. So.
So I understand you recently divested yourself of most or all of your Atari 8-bit stuff. Why now? Why 2023? Was it time to go?
Well, the big deal is that my car is coming back from the shop. So I have my original cadet car from when I was at the academy, 62 190 SL, and it's been in the shop for over 18 months now, getting totally redone. And I have to get rid of things in the garage so that car will fit into our 3-car garage. So right now it's 2 cars and a lot of boxes. So, and then the other thing about it was, as I've seen that, I'm 67 now. I just don't have time for to pick up another hobby because I'm sort of trying to figure out, what do you do with your time? My dad had a lot of guns, and I inherited them, and and I went hunting when I was a kid and all that kind of stuff. But I ended up getting rid of all those because I just don't have time for it because there's only so many hours in a day, and my interests now are focused in other areas. So I just haven't had the thing. I always thought I was going to get back into it, and I was going to write all those programs to do machine control and do stuff with my computer. But now you just go on Amazon, you buy one, you plug it in, and it's not. It would be a kick in the ass. But I want to start playing my musical instruments and that kind of stuff. And I have a row of guitars I haven't touched for a long time. So I need to find some time. The problem is I do a lot of volunteer work, and so it's very difficult to have time for anything. And then work things around the house and stuff like that. It just take time. Everything requires maintenance. So that's why I didn't do it. The other thing is I have so much data now on my tower that just working through all that and organizing it, because I save everything, and so I'm kind of going through that whole process of my digital footprint or my digital footprint. Like you have your carbon footprint, here's your digital footprint, and they want to get that down to a smaller level of compactness and go through things. And so other thing I'm doing is sort of like I think you might be doing is I'm now scanning everything because the paper is starting to go and it's not findable, and that's one of the things I'm very big into. And I also am working a lot with libraries to give digital archive stuff to libraries so they can find things and other researchers can find things. Because eventually this will be a fascinating story to tell about the history. We have a lot of written things about how the early computers did. And I will tell you, I'm very proud and excited that I was a part of when this all started. I mean, uh, PCs were, that's when they came out, late 70s, early 80s. That's when the home computer kind of started, and it's literally revolutionized the way we do things in some good ways and some bad ways. To be honest with you, it's great that you and I can talk on this on Zoom and all that with our computers and all that kind of stuff, but I find it criminal that we can't have a PTA meeting without having a Zoom option. Whereas in the old days, we used to meet at people's homes in person and stuff like that. So I think that the issue of human interaction has somewhat been degraded a little bit by the computers things. And I probably was a part of that because I was working on that stuff to get all those bitnet things and the point-to-point nodes of communicating with somebody and leaving a message and all that, But there's goodness and badness to that. So, but like I said, you look back at what you did in those early days, and it really is present today. We helped make that happen by buying computers and owning them, and pushing that along and getting people interested in it. We wouldn't have had a U.S. Space Command. We wouldn't have had a network if it wasn't for a couple majors in the J5 that let's just string this. Well, should we tell the captain? No, I don't know. Let's just do it. We'll hide the wires. Then we'll be able to talk to each other and send files and then I have to walk around the other side of the cubicle. I mean, this is what we were talking about. And so, uh, and then people thought that was kind of cool. And then we hooked the boss up to it, and he says, "Oh, I don't even have to. I can just send you this letter, and then I don't have to have the secretary type it up, and then you mark it up and give it back to her. Right? So cool stuff." And that all started with little home computers. Like I said, everything on Current Notes was done on my 8-bit through the internet around the world. We had authors around the world. All was done that way. Which was unusual. I mean, that was not going on that early in time about that. Very people had email accounts back in, the early 90s. And so,
what haven't I asked you about the Atari days that I should have?
There was a lot of junk software out there. Oh my God.
Okay, go ahead.
You'd buy some of these programs, you stick it in, what was this guy thinking, when you turn on. So there was a lot of chaff in the wheat during those days. But and you don't know whether it was what the motivations were. Some people were just so proud that they got, the something to display on their screen and stuff like that. And so that was kind of a neat thing. But I think a lot of things were probably released too soon and didn't have upgrades and stuff like that. The other thing I will say is that some of the things that were done in terms of the thought process that went into them were absolutely amazing. You can still play. I was talking to my friend who I gave all this stuff to, but some things come to mind. Like Mule, you can play that today. My kids, they're in their 30s. They said, "Dad," they're not going to be able to do it anymore. We might be able to find a PC, but they love to play that game. Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, but all these adventure things, the thought that went in, not just the programming part, but the intellect that went into coming up with a concept for how these games and programs work. Because those aren't shoot 'em up programs. Those are, and then my kids, I showed them what a text adventure was. And they thought that was fascinating because you can't go. And back then, you really had to figure this stuff out. You can look on the internet, walk me through this. That didn't exist back then. Well, see, should I kick the rock? Should I do that? But the process that went into some of the early computer programming, and a lot of that was on the Atari, by the way. It was just amazing. And then some of the other things about how they got some of these programs like Star Raiders into like that 16K. What the heck? You think about that today, that would take 16 petabytes to do that today on a computer. I mean, it's so that's a little bit wondrous because the stuff that people say but it was actually game changing in terms of thought process, algorithms, the creativity involved with that back then was just absolutely amazing. But there were some dogs out there as well. But
Yes.
Some of the stuff was really good. So there's a broad spectrum of things about that. And I found that to be kind of interesting. And people were obviously quick to point out when something was really cool and some things were really not. So anyway, that would be another contribution. I just feel sort of special to be a part of all that with my dad and my friends and the club members and the support you have of the early computer community back then was just awesome. Is people were really committed to it. They came to the meetings and stuff like that. They really were committed to that, and they on the cutting edge of that stuff. So anyway, that's sort of my thought about that.
Great, good answer. I think this is my last question. If you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit community that still exists, that are still playing with their Ataris today, and you can right now, what would you tell them? What would you tell
them? I would say there's no limited amount of innovation that can happen with an Atari 8-bit computer. Like I said, once again, it's one of a very solid architecture, well understood, well documented, and that if you can figure out another thing to do with it, go for it, because this probably could be done. There's so many things that I didn't get to in my explanation to that. So and you remember, you're a part of the cutting edge of it, and I there was obviously a lot of competition between Apple II, Commodore, and Atari at the time. But I really felt that after looking at it, because my dad did the analysis, that you pick the right computer, you pick the right one, because it literally There are people still out there with IBMs and Commodores and things like that, but Atari guys are much more committed and actually a lot smarter than I think the Apple II guys were. Because and so you made the right decision. You're a pretty smart person. That's my message to you for going that path.
Thank you, Rick. That was great.
All right.
Despite the blatant pandering at the end.
Okay.
This was great.
Well, thanks for touching me, and
thank you.
Reached out and touched me, and I think it's pretty amazing though that I did send you that one current notes.
That's wild. And then you noticed, yeah. When I was searching for your name today, before getting ready and looking for things that you wrote about. So I saw that cover and I just in the little thumbnails, and I was like, I remember scanning that. I remember getting that issue. I remember scanning that issue later, and I didn't realize it had come from you.
Yeah.
That's great. If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, please consider supporting my Patreon at patreon.com/Savitz. I've been publishing interviews like these since 2013 and would like to continue doing so for a long time, and your financial support will help. Thanks.